Welcome to the Institute for Catastrophic Loss Reduction's Friday Forum for January 27th, 2023. I'm your host, ICLR Chief Engineer, Dr. Keith Porter. This is one in a monthly webinar series hosted by ICLR, Canada's leading source for disaster resilience knowledge. Each month, we present recently completed research or other work related to ICLR's mission to make Canada more disaster resilient. Last time, we brought you Professor Hussam Mahmood of Colorado State University, who told us about a new mathematical model of fire growth and spread at the wildland-urban interface. Next time, we'll have a little change of pace from our more scientific and technological presentations. Our February 10th Friday Forum will bring human factors to our conversation, where Professor Rodrigo Costa from University of Waterloo will tell us about place attachment, which has to do with people's decision-making about permanently moving away after a big disaster. But today, it's my great pleasure to introduce Laura Zizzo and Emile Laverne of Manifest Climate. Laura Zizzo is co-founder and CEO of Manifest Climate. She founded Manifest to help businesses and governments adapt to climate change. She's a trained lawyer with expertise in policy and financial risk, and she is something of an ICLR alumna who worked with us in the past on hail seeding and other interesting topics. Laura is joined today by climate strategist Emile Laverne, a global affairs expert whose current job is to help organizations develop their climate strategy, disclosure, and scenario analysis. Laura and Emile will tell us about a draft guideline from Canada's Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions, OSFI, on how firms should manage and disclose their climate risks. The guideline will help financial institutions to understand, manage, and better communicate their approach to climate issues. OSFI's ultimate goal is to ensure financial market stability and resiliency in the face of climate change. Laura and Emile will help us to understand how insurers can prepare for those requirements. Before our speakers begin, here's our agenda. Our webinar lasts 90 minutes. Our speakers will present for about half that time. Then I'll moderate Q&A for the rest of the time. Please feel free to chat your questions into the Q&A box, and I'll try to pose your questions in the order they appear in the Q&A box. If we have a lot of questions, I may only pose your first one, then move on to other people, then circle back to your additional questions. Our webinar is recorded. ICLR will post our speakers' slides and a link to the video on Monday or so. So if you have colleagues who couldn't attend, let them know. And with that, I will turn it over to our speakers.
Great, thank you, Keith, and welcome everyone. Seeing attendee numbers continue to climb a little bit, but glad you could all join us, and it's a pleasure to be back, quote unquote, at ICLR. As Keith mentioned, I did start my career as a lawyer and did some research with ICLR on things ranging from hail seeding and the legal implications of that to municipal bylaws related to stormwater management, and all of that work. And Amelia, maybe you can go to the next slide, has gone into kind of bringing us here to Manifest Climate, because I realized after all that work on policy development and on thinking about things from a research and legal perspective, we needed to help companies understand, manage, and then communicate climate-related risk and opportunity. And one great way of doing that is through the regulatory compliance elements of climate-related financial disclosure. So today we're going to talk about climate-related financial disclosure, and in particular OFSI's new proposal that is coming down the pipe that's having TCFD aligned disclosure as a requirement for federally regulated financial institutions. And so happy to be here and share some time with you today. I'll pass it over to Emile for a quick intro as well, and then we can get into the meat of it.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for hosting us. My name is Emile Laverne. I'm a climate strategist, as Keith mentioned. I have the pleasure of working with Laura and our great team here at Manifest Climate. As you might have noticed from my background, I also have the pleasure of not being a lawyer. So I have expertise in climate strategy, disclosure, the meat of the OSFI draft guideline, and we'll be diving into that today. But I really encourage you all to pose those legalistic questions to the lawyers in your lives. But yeah, looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I have the pleasure of no longer being a lawyer, so no longer practicing, but we are kind of inspired by what's happening on the regulatory front and helping organizations understand this. The bigger issue is really about how you move through the climate transformation and how you talk about that with relevant stakeholders, one of which being the regulator. So let's get into it. We will be setting the scene first. So here we are with climate change as an issue that we have to think about from a regulatory risk perspective, right? We're going to talk a little bit about why. So climate change is, in my view, and I think many of us agree, the defining issue of our time, right? It is the biggest economic risk and structural risk to the system that is poorly understood. And it brings business risks and opportunities. And it's not just, I mean, ICLR knows this better than most, and members of this organization. It's not just about what your carbon emissions are, right? It's about how you move as quickly as possible to a net zero economy to stay financially relevant, and how you move to adapt to the impacts of a changing climate, which are massive. So what we're seeing is financial regulators saying, geez, we have not thought about climate-related risks and opportunities as financial risks to date. And it's time we put some rigor around that so that we can have comparability in the market and hopefully bring more transparency to these financial issues, and then help allocate capital to the stuff we want to support that's more resilient in the long term. So again, this is not a philanthropic effort on the behalf of regulators. This is not about, doing the right thing for the environment anymore. This is about how businesses can show resiliency and increase financial resiliency in light of climate as a big risk and opportunity. And so one of the ways we did that, if we move to the next slide, the TCFD, Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, was actually born, and many of you know this, but just to make sure we're starting from the same page, was born from the Financial Stability Boards when Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England and the chair of the Financial Stability Board. You may remember Mark Carney as the governor of the Bank of Canada first. So when he got into that position and was thinking about financial stability, they started saying there's a real problem here with climate risks and the tragedy of the horizon, his famous speech, the tragedy of the investment horizon, right? So we are thinking too short term. Climate change is going to blow everything up, potentially, literally and figuratively. How do we think about that? So they started the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which was a worldwide industry-led task force to think about how you can improve financial disclosures to integrate climate-related risk and opportunity. And they put out the framework back in 2017. And this is really around the 4 pillars that are now the basis of most of the climate-related financial disclosure regulation that we're seeing. So we'll go into more detail about how that actually works, how aligned it is with TCFD, but it's important to understand TCFD is actually the core of the OSFI regulations. We're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I want to talk about why, if we stay on that slide for just 1 second. Governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets. It's not common that we think about climate disclosures and financial disclosures right away as talking primarily about these bigger circles here around governance, strategy, and risk management. And then we get to metrics and targets. Only one of the 11 recommendations from TCFD is actually related to carbon emissions directly. So we'll talk about that later. But it's about putting all these risks and opportunities that exist in the system and thinking about what is the strategic management component and then the financial impact of that. And as we see implementation worldwide, we can go to the next slide. This is not just a Canadian and a federally regulated issue. This is something that is being implemented all around the world. So TCFD itself has been supported by governments in the G20. So that's responsible for over 85% of global GDP will be covered by some TCFD aligned reporting requirements. OFSI is sort of at the beginning of that from a regulatory perspective, but absolutely not the first. We're already seeing it in force in the UK and other jurisdictions. So Canada is definitely not the first mover, but it's in that first grouping of early adopters for thinking about TCFD alignment if and when OFSI becomes finalized. We can go on to the next slide. So how does this all work together? We have a bunch of international standards and domestic regulatory frameworks, and they use TCFD as their backbone. This framework that we talked about around governance, strategy, risk management, metrics, and targets is at the core. The ISSB, International Standards around Sustainability Standards Board, is now taking hold as the international, group that's trying to make some sort of customization or standardization across jurisdictions around how we think about sustainability standards. So ISB will start taking TCFD going forward. Those 11 recommendations are not going away, but then they're getting more specific standardization coming out of ISSB. So that is still on the regulatory, not like pre-regulatory side, international standard development. Then the regulators will come in and say, in jurisdictions, how are we going to implement these rules and require them? So question around what's regulated, what's voluntary, no matter what, there is a market momentum going where alignment with TCFD is required. And then the jurisdictions will have specific elements that may be a bit different, but what we're seeing is there's quite a bit of alignment. So TCFD as the backbone standard across most jurisdictions going forward. So when we think about the implementation of TCFD, I wanted to share with you some of the results of Manifest Climate's benchmark review. So you might think, okay, didn't they say Laura was a lawyer? Now we're talking about Manifest Climate. What is Manifest Climate? So Manifest Climate is a software as a service firm that is actually using our climate expertise from folks like Emil and myself who've been thinking about this for a long time and building technology to help scale. How can we use the power of technology and data science to make sense of what we're seeing in the market? So we've actually developed a methodology that can look at public disclosures and see how aligned it is with the TCFD and other related regulatory compliance frameworks. And what we've seen from our benchmark review, which we're happy to share with anyone who's interested, is we are seeing more uptake of TCFD in the market. The stats that you're seeing here are about 3,000 company reviews in 65 jurisdictions. So you're seeing they're getting more and more aligned with TCFD. It's expected that there's this type of disclosure related to board and management approaches to climate, how you're thinking about climate-related impacts on your business, how you're thinking about integrating climate issues into overall risk management, and then, of course, things like metrics, emissions, and are you thinking about targets and integrating that into your overall business strategy? So we could go into a lot more detail on that, but we can answer questions around how that works later. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, but just to show that these are the core 11 recommendations from the TCFD, and they are very aligned. Emil will go into more detail about this with how OFSI is thinking about things. But we wanted to set the stage on, this is not just OFSI regulated organizations that have to think about this. This is something that all organizations are thinking about, all publicly traded organizations are thinking about, and you're in good company thinking about, oh, what does this mean? One of our clients at one of the larger banks in the US actually said, it's causing a lot of internal strife and communication challenges, because this is really about change management for climate change. And these are hard conversations, but he said to me, Laura, that's a feature, not a bug, right? So the fact that this is challenging, the fact that this doesn't really make sense for risk managers in the normal way we think about risk, and maybe CFOs and financial disclosure experts in the way they normally think about accounting, but we have to think of this in a more integrated and systemic way to deal with the climate crisis. So I think I'm turning it over to you now, Emil.
Thank you, Laura. That was a great overview. Really appreciate the context there, especially the linkage with the TCFD. I'm going to use the next few minutes to dive into the actual guideline. We're going to talk OSFI, what it contains, what it means, how to think about it, how certain insurers are already doing some of the work without the guideline being formalized already. So jumping in quickly, moving forward, I'm just going to refer to it as the guideline, but just so that we're all on the same page. In this conversation, I'm referring to the draft guideline B15, which covers climate risk management. Some of you may already be familiar with it. If you are, you would know that there are 2 chapters. The first chapter deals with climate risk management. So what organizations do to manage climate-related risks. It focuses in on governance and risk management. There are certain recommendations around climate-related scenario analyses, as well as capital adequacy and liquidity considerations. That is the first chapter. The second chapter deals with disclosures. So the TCFD, as we've covered it so far, provides the framework that we saw on the previous slide, and OSFI, as you'll soon find out, builds broadly on the TCFD. As I mentioned, it is a draft guideline. It is expected out in 2023. Some people have said spring. Again, I'm not tapped into that world to know the exact date. If you have some contacts, maybe you can get a more precise date, but we know it'll happen this year. And then, paraphrasing OSFI's own words, you'll see its 3 desired outcomes as stated in the draft guideline on the screen in front of you. So just going to read them so we're all on the same page. Insurers, here I use insurers instead of FRFI, but those are financially regulated financial institutions, which fall under OSFI's mandate. So they want organizations to understand and mitigate against the potential impacts of climate-related risks to their business model and strategy. This isn't just about knowing, it's about action as well. They want to ensure that the action that is taken is underlined by governance and risk management practices, not just one-offs, and that they manage the actual risks that have been identified. And then finally, they want to make sure that FRFIs, or in this case insurers, remain financially resilient through severe, plausible climate risk scenarios and operationally resilient through any disruption. I know Keith mentioned your previous conversation was about wildfire spreading at the urban wild interface. That is likely featured in many climate-related scenarios. So part and parcel to the conversation we'll have it today. Before we dive in any deeper, just want to note a distinction between OSFI and the TCFD. The way the first chapter, climate risk management, is structured, there's a lot of use of the word should around what organizations should do in OSFI's view to effectively manage climate-related risks. The 4 topics, I mentioned them a moment ago, cover governance, risk management, climate-related scenario analysis and stress testing, and capital and liquidity adequacy. OSFI sets out what they believe, again, in this draft, and it might change in the future, financial institutions, in this case insurers, should do to manage climate well. In contrast, the TCFD is a framework that says, here are the things that we believe reasonable investors should be educated about from a company's disclosures. They should be able to read a TCFD disclosure and understand things about an organization's governance, strategy, risk management, et cetera. And in so doing, they structure their recommendations about what information should be disclosed. Nevertheless, they provide enough guidance in both the recommendations and subsequent guidance documents that dive into the 11 recommendations that the TCFD materials put out into the world can just as easily serve as a disclosure framework as they can for a roadmap of action. In other words, if you end up having content to disclose for every single TCFD component or sub-recommendation, you'll be well on your way to effectively managing your climate risks and your opportunities. And in fact, if you cover all elements of the TCFD, you'll find that although it is structured differently, the OSFI climate risk management component of the proposed guideline will be covered by and large. So there are certain metrics that OSFI is a bit more prescriptive about. But again, if you cover OSFI TCFD recommendations, you'll see that, especially with respect to strategy, TCFD covers quite a few topics. That's the climate risk management. Now, touching briefly on the second chapter, which has to do with climate-related financial disclosures. So 2 elements of good news, well, actually 3. There is a gradual phase-in. So once the rule is finalized, it is expected that the implementation year will be 2023. And from there will be a series of mandatory climate-related financial disclosures. The structure of those disclosures is broadly aligned to the TCFD, especially what goes into effect immediately. That being said, financial institutions have some flexibility when it comes to where and how they disclose this information. OSFI is simply saying, here are the things that you need to say, not here's the structure that you need to use to communicate this information. And that just as well, they say that you can disclose it in whatever report you seek, as long as it's an annual disclosure. Between us, we have seen best practice because, as Laura mentioned, we review hundreds of companies, we have a database. The best practice is to structure things broadly in line with the TCFD categories, and to do so in a grouped area in whatever report you choose to disclose in. But again, that's more what we see as best practice as opposed to what OSFI specifically calls for. Now, what does this actually look like in practice, right? As I mentioned, we have this database of manifest climate, and we've pulled some examples. So let's dive in right now. So in the climate risk management chapter, again, that's the chapter that tells organizations what they should be doing to, in OSFI's eyes, effectively manage climate risk. They have a governance section, and in it, they have a series of principles across all these pillars. And here we see on the bottom left, a sub principle. So it encourages organizations, this is paraphrased from OSFI's draft guideline, to identify and understand climate-related risks, fair enough, and their impact to the organization's short and long-term strategic, capital, and financial plans. So that's quite a lot of information that OSFI believes organizations should be uncovering. Now, the good news about the climate risk management component of the OSFI guideline is that there is no phase-in schedule in contrast to the disclosures, which are themselves on a set implementation year schedule. Again, I defer to the lawyers as to what exactly that means in terms of the should versus shall and all of that. Setting that aside, we pulled an example from the cooperators, which has a TCFD report. So, as we see this OSFI rule phasing in, we see that insurance companies are already, by virtue of disclosing things in line with the TCFD and by virtue of maturing on the climate question internally of their own volition or due to investor pressure or due to internal pressures, they are already doing the work. So the good news is for organizations that have not begun, in addition to the mountains of guidelines published by the TCFD, there are already examples in the market of organizations grappling with these questions. So here at the top of the screen, you'll see a screenshot of the Cooperators 2021 TCFD report, wherein they list on the left-hand side climate-related risks, the broad bucket. So in this case, these are physical risks. And then in the middle, a description of what the risk itself is, a couple lines here and there about the impact to the organization and how they're actually dealing with it. And then finally, the time horizon. What you'll note is that this is partial alignment to what OSFI, again, says organizations should be doing, and not full alignment, because to reach full alignment, the organization would need to disclose how they view the impact to the organization's strategic, capital, and financial plans. Now, you might be telling yourself, hey, that sounds really complicated. It needs a lot of data. You need to be correct. Nevertheless, certain organizations are moving forward on that. The takeaway here is there are examples of organizations that are well on their way to understanding it, and they might be understanding it internally more so than they are disclosing, because again, this is a public disclosure. But yeah, the takeaway is OSFI is recommending actions that are already being done by certain market actors, and yet those that are in the lead, if it's not a race, but if the ones that are doing well are not fully aligned to the recommendations set out by OSFI.
Yeah, I'm happy. Like, it is a race.
That's fair. Yeah.
I can say it. It's a race. We're in a climate crisis, and there's a big transformation happening. So when we think about like how you think about this, it is at that macro level. What's our business plan for this? How do we think about this in the short, medium, and long term? So it's really about that big thinking. That's what we want you to take away from the first part of this. It's about the big thinking, like who's doing the big thinking and how is really what they're asking. And the details will come. But is someone in charge of this from a big thinking perspective? And how are you integrating this into, how you think big? Because it is the biggest economic transformation that we've ever seen that needs to be done in, the next few decades. So people are nervous about the amount of work there is to do, and rightly so, but it actually is required, not just because the regulators are asking for it, but because we're going through this transformation. And so hopefully the cooperators example here gives people comfort that like it's surmountable and we're all sort of in this together. So learning from the best practices that we pull out, that's the point of it, not to make people kind of nervous about the scope and scale of this, but actually to say there's ways we can get going and what can we learn from our best practices to move faster. Sorry for interrupting, Emil, but you know how I...
No, absolutely. I just want to echo what Laura said. It is, daunting and yet doable. And I think that, based on our understanding of the coming challenge and its impact on society, markets, and our financial system, doing that, what is seemingly daunting today, is much less work than we would do were organizations to not act. So to that end, to the enormity of the challenge, OSFI and other climate-related disclosure frameworks really want to see that there's effective governance within the organization, and they call for disclosure of board level and management level engagement on climate risk management, right? So they want to see that the top of the organizations are actually working on these topics, that there's existing accountability, and not only that these things exist, but that they are disclosed publicly, in part so that organizations can do what we're doing today, which is looking across the aisle, saying, oh, what are you doing? Oh, okay, perhaps that's a good practice that we should adopt, right? It also engages investors, and it allows regulators to monitor the actions taken by, in this case, regulated insurance companies. So, diving a bit deeper, if we look at the bottom left here, we see the 2 recommendations for climate-related disclosures that OSFI calls for. So that's in their second chapter. This would go into effect once the rule is finalized after October 31st, 2023. So in other words, it would likely be a part of the disclosures published in 2024, looking back at the fiscal 23. And it calls for 2 elements of disclosure. It calls for, a description of the board of directors oversight and climate-related risks and opportunities. It also calls for a description of management role in assessing and managing climate-related risks and opportunity. And I'm going to blow everyone's mind here. That is exactly what the TCFD calls for in their governance section. So in other words, if you have begun familiarizing yourself with TCFD, if you have peers that are working on TCFD, they likely have disclosures. You likely have information internally that you can surface to populate these disclosures. Now, the thing to keep in mind with disclosure is that because you are being, this information is being requested, it is not saying that you should be done. What regulators, investors, and other key stakeholders want to see is information. So if the honest answer to what is the board of directors oversight of climate-related risks, if the honest answer is, oh, well, we have a sustainability steering committee and they have a plethora of issues that they deal with, climate is one of them, and there's limited oversight, maybe we talk about it once a year, that is actionable information for regulators. Again, there's a climate risk chapter 1 wherein regulators, in this case OSFI, are saying what they want organizations to do, in theory, at least over the long term. And then the disclosures want to see every year, show us what you're doing today. What can you disclose to us about the opportunities and risks that are being overseen by your board? And if we look at the example on the screen, we see an example from Intact Financial Corp's 2021 Social Impact Report, wherein they describe the structure of risk and audit and climate compliance and other board committees, and the ways in which climate change is overseen at the board level. So from a board perspective, as well as down into their board related committees. And in disclosing this information, right, not passing judgment on what the actual content is, but in disclosing this level of transparency, Intact, and again, this is not legal advice, but broadly aligns to the first element of the governance disclosure requirements set out forth by OSFI. If we move on to the second part of their, this bottom of the page, actually, I put it over 2 slides because it didn't fit on one, but it is, if you can imagine it, 2 parts of 1 page, you'll see what is happening at the management level. So this is about enterprise risk, all these other management committees. And again, setting aside what is actually covered and the actions that are being taken by the organization, this level of transparency where it deals specifically with climate risk management at the management level, and on the previous slide at the board management level, you see that these organizations are, or this organization in question is aligned to broad strokes, the governance disclosure requirements set out by OSFI. So, the takeaway here is, yes, it is a lot of information to disclose. Yes, the climate risk management element is somewhat complicated, can be nuanced, it can be daunting, to Laura's point, we need to act, and that's why regulators are acting. And there are examples in the market where you can see the ways in which other organizations are working on this to date. If your organization has begun sustainability reporting or TCFD aligned reporting, odds are that you have some of the information, if not most of the information, that is called for or that will be called for once the guideline is finalized. Okay, so that was a lot as an example, kind of thinking about this in practice. Now let's take a look into the future and see kind of what implementation of or full alignment with OSFI might look like. Now, again, not legal advice. This is just a way to consider full alignment with OSFI's draft guideline over time. If the guideline changes, of course, we need to revise this. But starting this year, in 2023, we encourage you, or any organization that is, wants to comply or needs to comply with the OSFI guideline, as well as any other organizations that might not, although that might be few, to just really identify what are you doing internally, right? There is likely a process, to Laura's earlier comment from a client of ours. It is internal change management. And one of the first steps, if not, the first step, is understanding what an organization is doing internally, assess what you've reported in the past, what you plan to report in the coming disclosure cycle, and assess where you have capacity, where you could build capacity, and where you, to fully align with the climate risk management recommendations, where you would need to go over the next few years. In other words, develop a plan, begin acting on it, and over time, you'll tweak it as best practice emerges. Maybe there are regulatory updates, etc. But that really begins this year. And it's related work streams, but they can be thought of as somewhat separate. There is the internal work that an organization needs to do to improve their climate risk management, as well as any work to do to increase the transparency of climate-related financial disclosures. Now, as I mentioned, the disclosure element, once the rule is finalized or the guideline is finalized, will come into play for the fiscal year 2023. So it will likely be published in 2024. And the elements that are required at this early stage, again, the disclosure requirements phase in over time, will be touching on governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics. And again, spoiler alert, those are the same categories as the TCFD recommendations. So if you're engaged in a TCFD reporting exercise, or you've thought about it in the past, you might already be well on your way to at least understanding the information that you have available on this topic, right? Now, moving forward in time, by the middle of the decade and onwards, you'll need to be continuing to strengthen your climate risk governance. That includes preparing the information that will be phased in from a disclosure perspective. So there are certain metrics that OSFI will mandate disclosure-wise, 2026, 2027, 2025, all that, and developing the underlying processes to identify and measure these metrics so that you are ready for disclosure when those disclosures become mandatory, means that you will need to develop climate risk management processes that will either produce these metrics or integrate them into your decision making. So a good example is the ISSB, so the International Sustainability Standards Board, which, moment of Canadian pride, it's based in Montreal. They're going to finalize a rule shortly. They have metrics that they recommend organizations disclose on climate-related risks. One of these is measuring your climate risk exposure. Now, that's not back of the envelope math. You need to actually assess climate-related risks relevant to your organization, the ones that are, impacting your supply chains, your value chains, your clients, your assets, et cetera. And then from there, you need to calculate your exposure to it. So that's why that metric is phased in over time, but that thinking around it needs to start as soon as possible, at least identifying the teams within your organization that would have access to this information, what they need to in order to fully understand your climate-related risks and calculate this metric. So, ideally, that metric, per OSFI's view, would be actually integrated into decision-making, risk management, et cetera. But at the very least, it needs to be disclosed, again, around mid-decade. And, there's other examples of that. So scenario analysis is another example, and so on. So, this is a hypothetical view of if you really only strive for regulatory compliance, the things that you should be working on. But to Laura's point, time is of the essence. There is quite a lot of guidance and support that exists out there for scenario analysis, climate-related scenario analysis, to help you understand your risks and your opportunities, to help you educate your boards, your management teams, to help structure that governance. Of course, you can't do everything overnight, but you don't also need to wait until 2027 to start working on these topics, right? So this is more with a compliance lens than with a consideration of what is feasible today. So let that percolate a little bit. And then, looking into the future, let's zoom in on 2023. What I really want to draw your eye to is the bottom. So disclosure specific milestones in the coming year. I mentioned the ISSB, which is the International Sustainability Standards Board. They will finalize their rule. OSFI will finalize their rule. The SEC in the US will finalize their rule, all related to climate-related financial disclosures, which have a climate risk component to them. But these moves do not exist in a vacuum. In fact, over the next year, we'll see, in the UK, in the EU, and elsewhere, stock takes, analyses of the resilience of certain systems, including the financial system in the US. We'll see a renewal of global action with the renewal of nationally determined contributions, which are the fancy way of saying what countries commit to doing to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, which, as a reminder, is to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees over pre-industrial levels. So, we've been looking at a micro level. What are organizations doing? How can you improve your climate risk management? How can you improve your disclosures? But this is not existing in a vacuum. This is, bringing us back to Laura's first slide about climate being a global phenomenon. This year will be the year of regulatory developments, of international and scrutiny, of import bans, et cetera, so that diplomacy gets involved. So quite a lot of developments on this front, which makes investors and regulators all the more interested in the ways in which financial institutions are thinking about these different phenomena. I'll pass it back over to Laura for this next slide.
Awesome. Thanks, Emil. And yeah, so the reason that this is now becoming urgent is both because there's a regulatory push, but also we're out of time from climate perspective. So we have to halve global emissions by the end of this decade, but emissions continue to go up. So that requires thinking of dual risks, as I talked about before, which is a rapid and potentially not very smooth transition to low carbon. They call it a disorderly transition. And thinking about the fact that we have to deal with more extreme weather events, which you guys think about more commonly with the ICLR, and thinking about extreme weather and what that means for businesses, what that means for financial institutions and insurance companies from a business model perspective and from a resiliency perspective. So we saw this as a big opportunity for technology to help solve some problems. So we created Manifest Climate to help with that. I want to also just talk about two things here as we go into it, but one is, Emil talked about the location of disclosure and how OFSI is not being super prescriptive about the location of disclosure. And in fact, that's one of these other features, not a bug, because if we truly want to get this integrated, it shouldn't be a separate TCFD aligned report. That's actually not what the TCFD is asking for. It's asking for it to be integrated. But then it becomes a challenge with how are we thinking about this information if we don't have something to go and look at climate on its own? So that was where the idea for Manifest came from, is what about if we can ingest, using the power of AI and machine learning, thousands of pages of disclosure instantaneously and put a machine learning model on top of it to make sense of those disclosures and align them to climate. So we're really proud of the methodology that we've created and what we're able to show, and actually really pleased that we're going to be working with OSFI to support assisting Canadian financial institutions alignment with the TCFD framework. They're actually quite interested in our methodology and thinking about how we can parse out some of the regulated entities' disclosure for them. So really excited to be part of this conversations from a number of clients, including regulators. If we go on to the next slide, we can talk about what makes this interesting, right? So we talked a lot about metrics and targets, or I mean, you talk a lot about that in general when you talk about climate and emissions and scenario analysis outputs. But really the stuff that's under the water of this iceberg, risk management, strategy, governance, it's what me and Emil have been talking about most, right? And it seems a little bit hard to take, but what we are focusing on is saying, how are organizations thinking about that? What does best practice look like? Like if you want to see some examples of great executive comp policies linked to climate targets, that's what we've decided to pull out because you're expected to talk about that. Like how are your executives being compensated for thinking about climate as a core business risk or a core business opportunity? So we are really focusing on risk management strategy and governance, also metrics and targets. I also wanted to spend a second talking about scenario analysis because we kind of glossed over some of that. But what this disclosure is asking for is think about your company in a 2-degree world. If we actually restrict climate change to no more than 2 degrees, what does your business look like? And there's 2 elements to that, right? 2 degree is still bad from a physical risk perspective, but it's also wildly different from an energy systems perspective. So those 2 things are going to have market disruption. What you apply that long-term thinking to your business strategy and discuss it. That is within the strategy pillar of the TCFD, and it's a lot. So full compliance with scenario analysis, like we help our clients do that at a high level. There's other tools that do it like really a lot more granularly, but those are the types of things that we have to start thinking about now if you're going to be ready for the disclosure that's going to be required over the next 2, 3, 4 years. If we go to the next slide, and I see a couple of questions starting to come in, but want to encourage you guys to start asking questions because we're going to have enough time to kind of have a robust discussion if there's questions from all of the listeners. Okay, so we are a climate risk planning tool that is combining the power of our technology to help scale our expertise. And part of the reason I really wanted to create Manifest was because I was talking about big companies. We did a lot of research with companies like large financial institutions, big organizations, and they can afford the consultants to help them do this. But we know many of you work for smaller organizations or organizations that don't have huge consulting budgets around this. We wanted to provide a solution that would help you have the power of the capital markets, the power of climate expertise at something that was a little bit more accessible. So that's why we built Manifest Climate. And on the next slide, here are some of the ways that we're thinking about helping companies. So we help by ingesting this disclosure that it already exists, understand alignment. That's what we've been talking about a lot. So alignment with the regulatory requirements. But when you think about why is there a requirement to disclose, it's really about doing better. So we help surface what doing better looks like, how you can be inspired by other companies' disclosure to do better and move along the climate transformation journey, and helping you benchmark, track, and track peers. So many of our clients say like they're sitting through and control Fing, right? You're trying to find this stuff. So one of our clients says, why don't you call yourself Control F? So we're trying to like figure out what's important from different disclosures out there and just connect the dots. And then obviously continue to provide thought leadership, trends, and insights so that we can help move people around along the competency journey and see beyond kind of the short-term challenges that we all certainly have. If we go to the next slide, what can we focus on this year? So we get a lot of questions around that. This seems like a lot. What should we be doing? So focus on impact. Think about where you are. So get that gap analysis to understand where you are and make sure you're not behind peers and the regulated and alignment elements that there's some expectations around right now. Even if you're not fully required by law, there are some expectations in the market that you have some sort of a story here, and then start with alignment with the standards. So I'm happy to discuss more and answer questions, but also know that we're available to support if you have more questions about how our technology might be able to support as well. Keith, happy to have a facilitated discussion now.
Great, thank you so much. That was really interesting talk. We have one question in the Q&A, but I want to ask mine first. Sorry, Joel. Would you kindly speak to some balance sheet issues for me in terms of the benefits and the costs of compliance and related disaster risk management? I get that companies are going to eventually have to do all this stuff, but they can, do the minimum to comply, or, they can do more if they think the benefits will be worth the expenditures. Can you tell us about, first of all, which benefits corporate executives find most compelling here? I mean, I can imagine better reinsurance decisions, or lower repair costs and business interruption for the insurer themselves, or lower reputation risk, et cetera. What do you find is the magic words that work best with executives deciding how much to dial up their efforts in this regard?
Yeah, if we had that magic word, it'd be a lot easier, because I think that there's just such a broad range of competency out there for this. But some of the things that have been resonating, you touched on already. Insurance cost management, we can talk about that. There's tons of cost reduction opportunities as insurers start to understand this. They're starting to put premium incentives in if you have a good understanding of climate change. So one of our recent clients, that got the CFO very excited when we actually could explain some of that to them, and it was a no-brainer to think about this because it's a cost saving. Emil can talk a little bit more about this as well, but I'll give two other examples. I always give the example of PG&E, one of the largest utilities in the US that became negligent, or was found negligent, related to the wildfires in California that ended up tragically killing folks. They had a climate program about reducing emissions. They didn't have a good adaptation and resiliency plan. They didn't adequately look at the fact that increased extreme weather and wildfire risks needed to be urgently considered to prevent loss of life in areas that they were responsible for. And that's what ended up potentially bankrupting the company. So thinking about this at a macro level, there are some huge risks out there that could potentially bankrupt your company if you don't actually have an eye to it. And when you think about that, the regulatory compliance cost for disclosure is really not the reason to be doing this. Right. The reason to be doing this is to think about what are these macro trends and how do they impact your business. That's why regulators are asking for it. They don't just want something more to think about. There's this actual strategic advantage and crucial risk management issue at play here. So when executives get that, that just opens up the team approach to this, a lot more budget. And I think that the other thing that is the magic word is don't fall behind. Right? Don't fall behind the trends that are happening in the macroeconomic world, or your peers and best practices that are going fast enough. So this idea of keeping up as we rapidly change is really something that I think is an impetus for change. Emil, what are you seeing in your work?
Yeah, I mean, want to echo all the things that Laura's highlighted. I would say, call attention to a couple examples. One, investors are requesting these disclosures and are knowledgeable about these topics, increasingly so, right? Either they are hiring consultants or educating themselves, and they want to see that organizations are being transparent about the contents of their in their climate disclosures, but that what is actually being disclosed demonstrates evidence of improvement. The topic of today with the OSFI guideline focusing on climate risk, that they're actually improving on climate risk, for example, right? They're actually conducting scenario analysis, not only that they have, an output from a scenario analysis, Laura mentioned conceptualizing the resilience of your business strategy, its assets, and your product service offering under different futures, but that output is actually being used and fed back into decision-making internally, right? We have clients and, thinking of the platform and the way it's structured, we do that, what we call the tracker, but there's a benchmarking element. Certain organizations like to think of themselves relative to their peers, but they also understand that other organizations, so for example, utilities that service large corporations, if those corporations set net zero targets, that is a shift in the market that utilities can use to their advantage to engage their own investors and say, listen, a lot of our clients are decarbonizing with us. Our strategy makes sense. If we're thinking about insurance companies, perhaps a lot of your clients have effective risk management policies. Do you know what your large clients and even your mid-sized clients are doing on climate-related risks? What are you doing internally to engage with them? How are you educating yourself on your product suite, et cetera? These are the types of processes that regulators, in the case of OSFI, and investors and other key stakeholders are really keen to understand. But in so doing, one of the hurdles that these recommendations help organizations overcome is surmounting the mountain of data. And it's like drinking out of a fire hose every day. There's a new news story that's coming out, and there's new data, and there's new modeling, et cetera. Do you have the process in-house and the expertise in-house or the appropriate external support to help you understand and integrate this information into the way in which you develop your strategies, into the way in which you manage your risks? And does that ladder up to a management committee? And does that management committee have an accountability? And do those executives have, a financial incentive to actually act in the best interest of the organization? These questions are what these disclosures help uncover. And if the answer is no, that's okay. That increased transparency in an initial disclosure, even in a second disclosure, demonstrates a good faith effort by the organization. But over time, the idea is that this will improve and change, and you will actually be able to, put some method to the madness of all the data that's coming in. So, I don't want to stick too much on physical risk, but let's use it as an example. There is, in fact, the, risk of acute weather events driven by climate change, worsened by climate change, think wildfires, on, let's say, ag clients. So, agriculture, if there's a fire and it burns all their crops, you then, if that's insured, have to pay it out. Well, everyone's clauses are different, but in theory, right? That's one element of climate risk. And maybe you're most aware of it because, again, it's acute. But think about the long run. If in these regions in which you insure, there is a prolonged drought, cough, cough, Ontario, cough, cough, the Western United States, do those clients that buy your insurance, will they need it? Will they still be growing things there? These are the long-term changes and the product offerings and the alterations that you could be doing strategically. Again, emphasis on strategic, not ad hoc, driven by process, driven by a logic that these regulators and investors are looking for. So, Key, that was a great question. I don't know that I can point to one thing, but I can point to everything, and that's kind of the point, right? It's a whole of an organization change, and introducing some level of structure via these structured disclosures can help these organizations think through all of this work.
And I want to ask the flip side of that same coin. You just told us a little bit about benefits, but there's also the upfront cost of compliance. And I assume that the cost of compliance is going to vary by the business size and its complexity. How many FTEs are businesses hiring to manage compliance, and how much labor goes into it, and expenditures and foregone revenue? Can you tell us about the cost side, the stuff that we know will show up in the next 6 months on the balance sheet?
Yeah, there's some good, similar to OFSI, the SEC in the US has had to do some cost of compliance elements for their regulatory proposal that's coming down, or a proposed rule change that's coming down, that's very similar, again, based on TCFD. And they're tagging it, and it's going to be different for every company, but in the hundreds of thousands of dollars. So for most companies that are regulated as public companies by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the US, I think the average was around $330,000 to do this. We certainly see our clients say, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars of compliance costs sometimes from a consultant to think about this. But again, how do you put a price on the change management and just having everyone learn a little bit more about how they think about climate change in their role? So I think, the costs are really hard to pin down, but this idea of there is going to be cost. There is going to be cost for this, but the cost of not thinking about it strategically dwarfs it. It's just like the age-old climate issue around, of course, there's cost to transition. but we're not going to have a livable planet if we don't. So it's
Right.
almost like it's like a silly question in some ways, but it's also like, if you want to stay in business, you better do this. And we can talk about the costs right now for compliance, or we can talk about the long-term costs of like not being in business by not doing it. So that's the hard kind of strategic questions that we often have to face. And we're trying to put more money to it, but it's hundreds of thousands.
Okay, thanks. That's useful. All right, so now I'm going to give the rest of the audience a chance here. Joel Henderson asks, what impact are the disclosures, which are increasing, having on the disclosing companies?
It's interesting. It's either, I mean, we just talked about the cost impact, but we certainly see this discussions, like the impacts being positive about understanding how our internal systems work. And I want to go back to something that we've kind of teased across a number of the discussions so far around, if you're managing risk, you're managing this stuff. You just haven't put the climate lens on it in some cases. And I think insurance in general is a little bit further ahead in thinking about climate, but for the most cases, this is just forcing the lens to be, identified that we've already put on this. So we say to our clients, if you're managing risk, you've already been thinking about climate change because it's happening. Like there's headwinds and tailwinds. So the impact of just having a more structured approach, as Emil was saying around it, is like we're seeing positive impacts. One of our clients, we work with financial institutions that are looking into their clients as well. And what we can say is one of our clients is now seeing alpha associated with just good governance disclosure. So those companies who actually can well define their governance approach to climate are outperforming in the market. Early signals for this, like really early signals, but we are seeing, actual improvements in market readiness from some of these things. Can't make the same thing for like greenhouse gas emissions, right? Like if we want to say lower emissions do better, like there's been a lot of studies around that. What I'm saying is systems of risk management, well-defined, are seeing actual outperformance.
Gotcha. Steve Lung asks, there are many roadblocks to complying with the new OSFI's climate risk guideline. What would be the top roadblock for most organizations, and what can they do about it?
Really want to take that? I'm happy to.
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And I hate to be the person that says it depends, but to a certain extent, it really does. So Laura made a great point about effective systems in an organization, good governance, helping that, integrate these recommendations. So if your organization is very well governed, then that might not be a roadblock for you. But if you're just starting out, if you're a smaller company and you haven't really thought about structuring, board committees on specific topics before, that oversee management committees that work on these same topics, et cetera, that might be a roadblock. What we see with large organizations typically, and I'm speaking here of a cross-sectoral lens, not just insurance, is there might be buy-in from the top for whatever reason, right? The CEO has heard about it, went to Davos, they talked a lot about climate change, and the sustainability team has been engaged. They've got their allies within risk and within investor relations and within whatever other teams. And the challenge that they face is education internally, making sure everyone understands what the issue is, what the mandate they've received from, on high management, the board, whoever, and what the organization specifically can do on this topic. So, climate change is more than just physical risks. It's often thought of exclusively in that way, or to Laura's point, in emissions reductions. And as we've hopefully conveyed today, it's more nuanced than that. It's broader, as I'm sure you've seen in your work. It shows up across organizations in many different ways. So there's an education component. There's also a look over my shoulder element, which I would wrap into education or embedding intelligence, for to use a fancy word. What are your peers doing? I think a lot of companies are understanding what regulatory compliance is, what best practice is, and then they'll land somewhere in the middle, and that'll be informed by what their peers are doing. And I would lump that into embedding intelligence, what organizations are doing, how it impacts them, but also what their peers are doing, and then that helps them act. But a third roadblock that we commonly see, and again, these won't show up all in the same organization. If it does, we're happy to help them, and there are many other talented folks out there that do so as well. It's where do we start? So we know, that there's governance strategy, capital and liquidity adequacy, and climate-related scenario analyses are all mentioned by OSFI. our view is start with governance. There's a reason that it's that outer circle with TCFD. There's a reason that it's the first component of the first chapter of the OSFI draft guideline. There's a reason that it's the first element of the TCFD recommendations of what organizations should be disclosing, because it helps you structure things internally. But beyond governance, okay, let's say you have good governance. What then? And I think making sense of how to act in a way that is actionable for the teams, right sizing it to your organization. Maybe you have a head of risk, which has a broad mandate and sweeping powers and a huge budget, and they can do all of the things at once. Or maybe you have a small team and you need to understand, okay, well, Jerry over there needs to do this, and this is his very narrow mandate, and he has no money. Like, how does he actually act on this, and how does it integrate into their work? I think that's a third roadblock. So, understanding what's out there, embedding intelligence, having good governance and good processes internally, and understanding and making things actionable for organizations.
I'm just going to add one quick point on what you said, Emil, which is getting overwhelmed by the full suite of recommendations is a roadblock. So overwhelm is a roadblock.
Yeah.
I think overwhelm is the main roadblock. I was at a conference recently and it's like, oh, there's a lot to do. So what we say is like, what is the next best step? What is the best next step? And just moving on that direction. And I think that's the climate challenge. It just seems overwhelming. And we phasing in regulation, some of these things that are more challenging about capital allocation, et cetera, that's not going to be right away. So start with something that is more simple, like the TCFD alignment, governance, all of that, not super simple, but not as complicated in some ways. And the overwhelm is really, I think, the biggest roadblock for most.
Gotcha. It's the problem is an elephant, and you're going to get overwhelmed by the elephant, but you're advocating taking the first bite.
Yeah.
Keith McIsaac asks, hello, I appreciate that every organization is different. However, can you discuss, based on your experience with organizations, how they structured the project teams? For example, who was on the team, at what authority level in the organization, to address the climate requirements?
Yeah, and we have a whole database that can give you more information about that too. But when we look at it, we look at like, who are the decision makers that are a part of this? And you generally still see a cross-functional team. You generally see a cross-functional team that would have some sustainability folks if they have it, but often it's now being driven out of risk or finance. So risk or finance will have it. If there's a strategy, it depends on who the champion could be, but it could fit under sustainability, risk, finance, or strategy. Often, in smaller organizations, CEO is involved in some of this because it's so strategic. But then we're seeing, depending on what the risk factors for the business are, whoever is in charge of those elements is obviously also part of this. So very often cross-functional team, there'll be someone who generally has disclosure obligation that has to herd the cats and understand what is our story and how do we talk about it. But the story usually includes some sort of cross-functional team. One of our insurance company clients says like, they tag people as climate competent roles. So in order to do your role properly now you have to have a level of climate competency. And then that's the type of thing that gets disclosed when you're thinking about management approach and risk management systems. So not a one size fits all answer as the questioner mentioned, but we often see this still in sustainability, more so moving towards risk and finance.
Cool. An anonymous attendee asks, to date, many property and casualty insurance carriers have been focusing their effort on managing climate risk through changes to their investment portfolio and review of their own emissions, which tends to be fairly limited to begin with. Is there an expectation in the future that insurers will be adjusting their underwriting portfolio or processes to reduce their climate-related risk exposure?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, but I think that the better answer for me to give to this question, not being an expert in this, is in the underwriting portfolio process, is if that's what's most important to your business, then you should change it. If we don't think that the controls will be there, like the purpose of underwriting, right? If we don't think that we've adequately assessed risk and we won't be able to have payouts that are proportionate to the risk, then of course we should change the way that we're thinking about risk. And I think that, we've seen that start to happen, and there's some big systemic issues at play here. we as economists, right? I was actually just at a roundtable with all the chief economists of pension funds in Canada. And we were talking about your assumptions may be based on things that are just wrong now. They're just wrong. And so our benchmarks. So when we talk about to our asset manager clients that are actually paid on performance against a benchmark, those benchmarks do not include climate. So you are seeing returns, you're being incentivized to keep the status quo when everything around us is saying we need to break the status quo to make sure that we don't have runaway climate change. There's a lot of systemic changes that need to happen in our underwriting process, in our incentive process, in the way that we think what good looks like. And that's a huge challenge. So yes, I think we're going to be moving in that direction. Do people know what they should be doing yet? I don't think so, but we need these rapid iterations. And that's why, you're seeing more organizations like us come up that are trying to get data out into people's hands quicker than you could do without the use of technology and AI. And now we have, a lot of different tools to help us go faster.
Cool. There are two more questions from anonymous attendees, but I don't know if they're the same one as the first one. So I'm going to go to the end, to the last one, which is from Simon Seguin, who asks, do you see some challenges for companies to provide the metrics and measures as acquired by the OSFI calendar? Challenges for metrics and measures.
Yeah. Go ahead, Emil, and then I can kind of give a little, I have a systemic point to make about this.
Sure. Yeah. Great question, Simon. Again, don't get mad. It depends, really. Like, let's look here. We have some of these phased in, structured by their implementation year. So let's go to the some of the later implementation years. You'll see here what these are all draft and they're proposed, et cetera. But if you look at some of the metrics that OSFI's suggesting that they will require over time, you'll see climate risk exposure. So probable maximum loss of insurance products from weather-related natural catastrophes in Canadian dollars. Do you measure that currently? If so, easy peasy. If not, you have a few years of runway to build out the systems that would surface this information. So it really depends on the maturity within your organization, what you're currently doing, and the data over time. I think what will likely happen, again, not a lawyer, all that disclaimer aside, if there are systemic barriers to obtaining this information, such as a lack of data availability for certain topics, I'm sure there will be regulatory engagement on behalf of the industry, and that will be addressed at some future date. In my view, currently, I don't see any systemic barriers of that nature to, at least at a high level, provide something that might be full of assumptions, but would still give you a ballpark estimate of what these metrics could be, and are directionally accurate in the way that they could help you manage your climate-related risks and inform your investors and your regulators about the information that they're seeking. So, in other words, the challenge would be understanding the processes you have in place to identify and measure these metrics. Like, are you currently doing it? Do you have it planned in the next couple of years? And then identifying the data inputs that you need, either generated internally or obtained through third-party sources, and then actually maturing the processes to actually, once you've identified the data that you need and you've tagged the people that need to work on it, actually doing the work. So if you get started now, probably not.
A specific example that we've heard from some of our clients as well is the Canadian subs of subsidiaries. So if it's a non-Canadian entity that has OFSI requirements, sometimes we don't track the data in the way that can have granularity for the Canadian operations. I think that's like a systemic issue that we can work around, but a lot of our clients they're concerned with not knowing exactly, to Emil's point. And I think that really the spirit of these regulations is not about exact, it's about direction. It's about, do we have faith that the direction is going? So I think, speaking to boards of financial institutions, they're like, tell that to our auditor. And I'm like, they're hearing it, right? Like, that's actually that's the challenge here, is like, how do we make good enough guesses about long-term economic sustainability in a way that we feel comfortable enough disclosing to a regulator or to the capital markets, but we know is probably not right. And I think those are some of the issues that get a little bit hairy, but it's okay to be like, here's the assumptions, here's what we're thinking could change. And that's what we're seeing. So what we're trying to bring out is like, that's how other people are talking about it. It's okay to talk about it like that. You don't have to have exact information to start complying with this.
Yes, and to further Laura's point, there is a partnership out there called the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, which is an industry-led group which focuses on financial institutions correctly understanding, again, not being extremely accurate, but understanding broadly the impact of their financing activities on global emissions. In other words, they started with banks and they asked the question, from the things that and organizations to whom you lend and in the organizations in which you invest, what is their direct emissions from those organizations, right? How much energy do they consume? How much do they emit at the centers of production? And they call that financed emissions. And the way that you calculate them is you estimate a lot of things. You have data quality levels that help investors understand, okay, you're at data quality 5, which is the worst level. That means you're, let's take real estate, you're estimating the gross floor area of your mortgage portfolio, and you're estimating the emissions factors in this region, and you're estimating this other element, but you have a broad, with error bars on either side, but you have an idea of, through our lending activity to mortgages, in this example, we're broadly financing X amount of emissions. Now that same group, PCAF, is also working on the insurance sector. So one of the final implementation year phase-ins for metrics will be scope 3 emissions. In other words, the emissions from the goods, service, or the activities and the assets that you insure. What is that number? And I suspect and I expect the guidance is, I believe, public now, that there will be a similar approach with data quality scores, wherein the lowest data quality score will have will be full of assumptions. And then as you move up the data quality ladder, you will get more and more granular data. But to obtain that granular data, again, it goes back to processes. What are the information, what are the data points you're collecting at origination? How are they managed internally on your IT systems? Can they be effectively pulled and analyzed on a yearly basis, et cetera? No one is expecting that organizations will do this overnight, which is why there's a phased-in disclosure schedule in the first place. And even beyond that, you can probably get those numbers before they are, at least from a compliance basis, mandatory, because there are these best practice efforts that are developing in the market today.
Cool, thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, first of all, Simon says, thanks for your answers. I'll be happy. I was happy to see that data quality was one of the elements you identified. So an anonymous attendee asks, what are some of the imminent short-term transitional risk impacts that should be realistically considered in scenario analysis?
I can take a first crack at that, Laura, and then pass it to you. Okay, so following the TCFD guidance, the first step of scenario analysis is identifying relevant climate-related risks and opportunities. In other words, identifying short-term transition risk impacts is the first step of analyzing the resilience of your business strategy over the long term, which is a non-answer somewhat by design, because every organization services different clients in different jurisdictions that have different assets. And as a result, if you insure exclusively oil and gas in Texas, and you have the same geographic footprint as an insurer that exclusively insures wind farms, your short-term transition risks will be entirely different, even though you might have the same footprint and same revenue and same FTEs, et cetera. So that initial step, that's a hyperbolic example, but that initial step of identifying which climate-related risks and opportunities are most relevant to your organization is the basis of any credible and detailed scenario analysis. That being said, regulatory changes is broadly going to be relevant across industries. Certain areas have carbon pricing, others don't. But what we do know is that, at least on the disclosure front, this is going to be the year of regulation. We see import bans in the EU, less relevant to your industry and your footprint, but regulation I would flag as a big one. and then market changes as well. But the guidance and the best practice is really to identify these for your organization before you go too far in analyzing how your organization would stand up to these different futures.
Yeah, and we should say like that's the issue is like what scenario you pick will actually have an impact on the transition risk elements. So there's various scenarios that you can use by modeling that's out there from the IPCC and others, and it's like, are you picking a 2-degree scenario that is orderly or disorderly? Are you so all of these things will impact the way that we think about transition risk in your scenario analysis performance. But one of the ways I like to think about it is like when we talk about regulatory risk, how would your business respond if you could no longer buy an internal combustion engine? We know that, where certain jurisdictions are making it illegal to sell internal combustion engine cars by 2035. So there's some ways to like granular signpost elements related to scenario analysis. And then there's ways to actually do a more, actual modeling exercise. We're looking at GDP at risk based on regulatory compliance. So there's two ends of the spectrum when we're thinking about scenario analysis, and it's going to really depend on like what inputs and assumptions you make to get that done in a relevant way.
And I would add, in addition to Laura's example around those internal combustion engine phase outs, it's a scenario analysis is supposed to identify both the risks and opportunities. If you sell tailored products for electric vehicles, that's a huge opportunity for you, right? So it's not just sticking to the risks in these analyses, it's also being open to the opportunities that come from a transition.
Cool, thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, what's your opinion on scope 3 disclosures? How practical is it going to be to obtain these data from the thousands of vendors property and casualty insurers use to service their policyholders? And could you please remind us what scope 3 disclosures are?
Yeah, absolutely. So scope 3 refers to indirect greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, I touched on them just briefly. In the case of insurance, it can include the emissions from the individuals or businesses that you insure. In other words, the emissions of the companies that you insure or the houses that you insure, et cetera. They're direct emissions. So the purpose behind scope 3 disclosure measurement and identification is so that organizations, once they understand the parts of their value chain that emit the most. So let's think of an insurance company, again, insuring exclusively oil and gas infrastructure. A majority of their emissions would be in that scope 3 bucket because these assets emit a lot in just, they have a bunch of heavy duty trucks and use, fossil fuels on site to burn and make holes, whatever. You get, again, hyperbolic example, but that footprint would be largest in their scope 3. If in contrast, you are insuring a lot of LEED certified buildings and those buildings are already retrofit, it's still important to understand your indirect emissions. And in fact, a majority of your emissions would still come from your insurance activities just by virtue of office buildings not necessarily emitting a lot. And if you insure a lot of insurance buildings, probably insure more buildings than you as an organization use. But to this anonymous attendee's question, there is an incredible amount of data that needs to be collected to have direct data from your clients and to have that assured. Now, rest assured, in practice, as I mentioned, financed emissions is really evolved with respect to lending and investing. So in the banking area, that organization I mentioned, PCAF, they have an assessment of data quality, and that data quality makes allowances for organizations that do not have the ability to collect this information from their clients. In other words, if you bank a lot of small mom and pop shops, they're probably not collecting their emissions. And even if you can tap into their utilities API to collect their emissions information, that in and of itself is a challenge, and your IT systems might not be up to the challenge. So there is an allowance for a low data quality score, which helps you make an assumption where, let's say you tag a bunch of policies as insuring X sector, there will be an emissions factor there that will help you understand at a high level, this is roughly the information, roughly our footprint for scope 3 are our indirect or financed emissions, or insured emissions in this case. The point is, you don't need to wait to be perfect to get started. These systems are built in a way to allow you to get started, get the ball rolling, to understand directionally where your largest impact is, the largest impact of your clients is, et cetera, so you can have effective engagement with said clients.
To Emil's point, like banks, when they're trying to get their scope 3 emissions related to their mortgage portfolios, to use an example we can all understand, are not going and surveying mortgage holders. That's not happening. We're making assumptions based on what we know to inform that. And to the bigger question of what is your opinion on scope 3 disclosures, I love this, and this is my personal opinion. I think a lot of cycles have been used up thinking about how to get the numbers exactly right.
Yes.
And of course, we should be worried about data quality. And of course, we should be worried about this, but we have to get to 0 as quickly as possible. So stop with the excuses around data quality related to scope 3 is basically like my personal opinion around it. And let's talk about like extreme transformation as quickly as possible and how that works, because like that is what we're talking about. So I think it's a red herring, this discussion about how can we possibly get data from all these people. Make some guesses and try to get to 0 as quickly as possible, and think about your role as the insurance sector and how you can actually accelerate that, because then you'll be an economic winner.
Yeah.
And that's the change of mindset that we're hoping to see from some of these more strategic questions. And unfortunately, a lot of the questions end up being about data quality, which is of course important, but kind of losing the forest through the trees, in my opinion.
Yeah, agree.
Yeah, let's go, go ahead for a quick one, but we're going to kind of try to.
No, just quickly on that. The questions that sometimes arise when we engage with clients on scope 3 is, what about double counting? If I'm counting someone else's emissions, and the answer to that is, oh no, what if we all solve climate change too well? You know, let's there.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Our last question from an anonymous attendee: the timeline you showed for the disclosure out to 2026, was that the timeline prescribed by OSFI?
Yes, that is the short answer. They have implementation year tagged. Again, this is only draft, it might change. Talk to your lawyers about what implementation year means. But yes, it's starting in 2023. You will need to disclose the information you have in front of you on the screen. You'll note that the only thing that you don't actually need to disclose for a while is scope 3 emissions. And then from this screen, the larger insurers will have to, because there's an assumed capacity to be able to disclose certain information, will have mandates around certain metrics and targets. But every other federally regulated insurer that's maybe a bit smaller will have a phase-in schedule. And again, this is in line with the OSFI implementation year schedule put out by OSFI.
Cool.
And the short answer is the schedule goes out to 2027.
Great, thanks. That was our last question. This is all new to me. I'm interested. My expertise is in sudden onset disasters and so on. And what you're talking about today is about reducing those sudden onset disasters. So been really useful to me. And just want to let you know, this was one of the largest audiences we've had in the last year or so. So this topic is of great interest to our members. Thank you so much for presenting on it.
It's not just about reducing the number of acute events. It's about understanding how to deal with the fact that they're happening more and more. So at the same, we had to do both, and both are really hard. So really great to see, these different types of expertise coming together to solve the climate crisis. And yeah, it was a great conversation. Thank you for having us, Keith.
Cool, thanks very much. And we will give you all back about 5 minutes of your day. Remember, tune in on February the 10th when Professor Rodrigo Costa will tell us about place attachment and people's decisions about moving away from after big disasters. Everybody have a great weekend, and thanks again.